I'd like to share with you three ideas this evening. They're not too complicated. They're not too difficult. It's the end of the Tanis. And I think you can understand them and you can repeat them when the need arises, especially in Kiruv. You don't have to pretend that you know more science than you do. You don't have to pretend that you're an expert. But many people will be impressed by the fact that you care about it. You care about it. You've thought about it. You have something to say about it. When you get out of your depth, you say, okay, that far I haven't gone. Let's be in contact with somebody who knows more. But the very fact that you have something to say, you don't just eliminate the entire picture and disregard it as if it were worthless, because to the outsiders, it's a very important bargaining chip. They don't understand it either. But it is a criterion for being well-educated and intelligent and in the know, and therefore they repeat what they read on the blogs, which is worthless, but they repeat it, and if you have something to say, anything intelligent to say, I think it makes a difference in your general credibility. One issue that we are hit with all the time is the age of the universe. Let me tell you a Rambam. In the Moreh Nevuchim, Chelik Beis, Perek Yud Zayin, 2:17, in the Guide of the Perplexed. The Rambam was facing a much bigger challenge than ours. In his day, the universe had no beginning at all. It's infinitely old. That's what Aristotle taught, and that's what all the philosophical and scientifically minded people believed. The Rambam says, I want you to imagine a baby boy who's born, and after a few months his mother dies, and his father takes him to a community of men, just men. And the boy grows up. And at a certain point, the boy asks his father and the other men, where did we come from? How did we come into existence? All of us. And the answer he gets is, well, there are others who are similar to us in many ways, but different in some ways. And we all start out as tiny miniatures inside the abdomen of one of those. And we are there for months, and then we exit, and then we grow to be the way you see us now. So the grown-up child now asks, well, when we're inside the abdomen of those others, can we breathe? And the answer is no. Can we eat? The answer is no. Can we drink? The answer is no. The child says, then I know the story that you're telling me isn't true. Everyone knows that if you don't breathe for 5 minutes, you're dead. Everyone knows that if you don't drink for 2 weeks, you're dead. Everyone knows that if you don't eat for 2 months, you're dead. The story you're telling me is simply impossible. Look at the world. You see how the world runs. You see how people live. Without breathing, eating, and drinking, you can't live. Now the child is right. For the world that he sees, that's 100% correct. The life of an animal post-birth requires regular eating, breathing, and drinking. But of course, life in the womb is entirely different. It's entirely different. Based on an entirely different condition, running according to different rules. The baby is fed oxygen and nutrients through the umbilical cord. With birth, all that changes. The child who has grown up in a community of men and has no clue about gestation, has no clue about birth, has no way to deal with that other reality. Now the Rambam says, Sheish Yisimei Bereshis are the gestation of the world. That's the world in the womb. The condition of the world during the first 6 days is utterly different. Not 100% different, but utterly different from what it is afterwards. What we call the laws of nature are what we observe operating from the end of the 6 days onward. But before that, our laws, vast majority of the laws that we see running the universe weren't operating. They weren't operating. So for someone to say, well, this is how the world works, I have the law of gravity and I have erosion, that water takes dirt away and it cuts a channel in the earth, they go so many inches per year, and all the rest. Light traveling from distant galaxies. I know how the world works. And then to project backwards into the past without limit, that's simply, you could call it a fallacy, or you could call it an assumption. It's just an assumption that the way things operate now, they have always been operating. But that's just an assumption. And just as that assumption leads the boy in the Rambam's scenario to a false conclusion, so using that assumption in our world can lead to a false conclusion. So that means the scientific picture is based on an assumption. And you can say this to someone. How are you calculating millions and billions of years? Aren't you doing it by assuming that the way you see it operating today, it's always been operating? Well, that's an assumption. Can you prove that that's correct? Maybe it wasn't that way. And in fact, that means that if they've made their assumption it's always been the same, and they draw their conclusion from their assumption, the conclusion is no stronger than the assumption. If we have a different picture, you can't discredit somebody's picture because your picture is based on a different assumption. Assumptions are free. And in fact, one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, Paul Dirac, British scientist, his name is spelled D-I-R-A-C, said the same thing, not on religious grounds, but he said projections to the ancient universe are not trustworthy because the laws have not always been the same. The laws have been changing, and since the laws have been changing, you can't tell what the early universe was like. If you then ask, okay, but what about all the fossils, and what about all the light in space, and so forth and so on, there is a way to deal with that. It's Rabbi Schwab's way, and therefore it's Kodesh Kodashim. It's not the only way to deal with it, but I'll explain it to you because in addition to being right, it also makes people feel good. There are other answers that are equally right, but they don't make people feel as good. Because I'd like you to feel good, taking a little bit from the previous speaker, and because when you tell it to kids, to potential interested people, it's good to make them feel good as well. And I tell them the same thing. This is one true solution. It's perfectly acceptable. And it's going to make you feel good. And I'm telling you because I want you to feel good. There are others that won't make you feel as good. But this is perfectly okay. What Rabbi Schwab says is the entire history of the universe that the scientific world presents is true. All of it happened, including the dinosaurs, and including the explosions of stars, and all the rest of it is true. It all just happened much faster. Much faster. Millions, hundreds of millions of times as fast. Maybe in some cases billions of times as fast. It all was crammed into 6 24-hour periods. So yes, you can believe all of it. You can believe it all happened just as they describe on the surface what it looks like, just that it happened much faster. And if the sharp critic will say, but listen, things can't happen faster. I mean, if they happen faster, then you're going to violate what we know are the laws of nature. There's a fixed speed of light. Nothing can go past the speed of light. If you turn a corner too fast, your bones will break. I mean, things just can't go millions of times faster. Then you say, I told you already that the laws of nature that we have weren't operating then. And Rav Schwab says this. Why he doesn't footnote the Rambam, I don't know. He surely knew the Rambam. But Rav Schwab says it in the article. The laws of nature that we have weren't operating. So you now make room for the picture they've been taught. It's perfectly all right. Just turn the dial on the clock and have it go by faster. And everything they tell you is okay. It's just that. It has to be fit into 6 24-hour periods. And somebody says, but doesn't that mean that God is fooling us? Doesn't mean he's fooling us? The answer is no. And by the way, most of what I'm telling you comes from the classic, which came out 6 months ago, Torah, Chazal, and Science by Rabbi Moshe Meiselman. And I've had the privilege of learning with him for many years. Many of the things I'm telling you are really his Torah. And I would recommend it to you if you have the guts to pick up a 900-page book. with Chazal and Rishonim all laid out in detail and great and lots of scientific information. At any rate, doesn't it mean that God is fooling us? No, because He told us the truth. He told us how old the universe is. What you have is a split between the way it looks to your eyes and the truth. But He's not fooling us because He told us the truth. Of course, if someone says, I use my eyes and my fingertips, my nostrils and my computer, and that's all. That's how I make up my mind about the world. And religious traditions are nothing to me, then he's fooling himself. He's choosing to ignore the direct instructions from the creator of the universe. It's a free world, you can choose what you like, but you can't complain to God that you're fooling me if He tells you the truth. Now, someone with a little religious background will ask, but does God do that? Does God set you up for that kind of challenge where He creates the world one way and the truth is another way, and He tells you that the truth is another way, and force you to live in terms of His truth against what your eyes see? Does God do that? Of course He does it. Everyone in this room knows that He does it. You say it at least twice a day. In the first bracha of Kriya Shema in the morning, we say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mechadesh ma'aseh breshis tamid. You don't see that. No scientist will testify to that there's a divine energy flowing into the world continuously, and that's why it continues to exist, because He's making it continue to exist. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world looking as if it were carrying itself, a blind machine operating on its own. That's the way He created it to look. But again, He isn't fooling us because He told us the truth. And someone who ignores what He told us is fooling himself. That's one way to talk about the age of the universe. Related to this question is a very bitter story, bitter for the scientific world. And this story is worth telling. It's worth telling to people because it has an indirect effect on our own credibility. All scientific and philosophical opinion until the year 1965 believed the universe has no beginning. That's what Aristotle taught. And the Newtonian view of the universe is that it has no beginning. I'm not talking about religious people with religious commitments. Many top scientists had religious commitments too, including Newton. But the scientific picture that they presented was a picture with no beginning. The late 1920s, a great astronomer named Hubble noticed something funny about stars. Stars give off light, and the light comes in various colors. You look at stars, the farther away they are, the more off their colors are. They're not right. They're not the right kind of colors. They're all shifted. If you have a spectrum from red to blue, on the spectrum, they're all shifted over. The further away they are, the more they're shifted over. Very funny. Why it should be that way? Presumably, they're all made of the same stuff. They're all undergoing nuclear fusion in the same way. They're giving off the same kind of light. Why, when we look at it, does it look like it's pushed over? And he said the reason is because they're running away from us. They're fleeing us. And the farther away they are, the faster they're running away. And when they're running away, that pushes the light over. That's where the idea of the expanding universe came into existence, because of Hubble's observations. Now, some clever people thought, let's run this scenario backwards. The universe is getting bigger and bigger, okay. That means yesterday it was smaller. Last year it was even smaller than that. Last decade, century, 1,000, million, 100 million, smaller and smaller. How small can something get? Isn't there a limit? The limit, of course, is zero. Once you get down to zero, you can't get smaller than that. Well, if in the past it's been smaller and smaller, there's got to be a beginning. It's got to be a beginning. You can't go back forever. That's what they thought. Early 1930s, people were playing with this idea. The scientific world was in panic. As Stephen Hawking writes, a beginning smacks of a creator. We can't tolerate that. We've got to get out of this. And they thought up an answer. They thought up an answer. It's called the steady state theory. Yes, everything's getting further and further away, and there's no beginning. It's always been getting further and further away, and there's no beginning. So you say, but well, wait a second. If it's bigger now, so before it was smaller, and the limit is 0. No, we have a way around that. We have a way around that. Here's how you get around it. Imagine space, the space we all live in, the space we all take up, and all pray we should take up less of it, so we lose some weight. This space goes on forever. It's infinitely big. So when things are moving away, there's plenty of room because it's unendingly big. And they've been moving away from each other forever. That's what's been going on forever. So you say, but listen, if they've been moving away from us forever, then there ought to be nobody in the neighborhood. There ought to be nobody in the vicinity because everything should be infinitely far apart. No, they had an answer for that also. Everywhere in the universe, new stuff is coming into existence out of nothing. New stuff is popping into existence out of nothing. And it's filling in the spaces. It's filling in the spaces in between the things that are getting further and further apart. And enough is coming in so that the average distance stays the same forever. It's been doing that forever and will continue to do that forever. And that's why it stays looking the same. Of course, if you wonder why you never go out to your backyard and find a brand new petunia that came into existence overnight, that's because to keep the universe balanced, all you need is about, for 1 cubic meter of space, for a century, 1 electron. You're not going to notice that in your garden tomorrow morning. It's not going to happen. So you can't see it. No one can say it's not true because I don't see it. And that's how you have a universe that doesn't change. So that was the new thing. Yes, Hubble is right. Things are moving away from one another. And they're moving out because there's no limit to how far they can go. And new stuff is coming in. And the universe has no beginning. And the scientific world heaved a sigh of relief. No beginning and no creator. All that kept going until 1965. In 1965, there was a scientific tragedy. 2 engineers at Bell Laboratories were trying to build a radio receiver that wouldn't have any static. No hum, no buzz. Pure radio reception. This thing was 10 feet tall and 20 feet deep, made of various materials, weird shapes. You see them, pictures of them inside it, walking inside and banging on this and smoothing out that. Bell Labs. And they found that no matter how they built it, no matter how they changed it, no matter which way they pointed it, which season of the year, which direction, day or night, even weekends, there was a hum, a background hum they couldn't get rid of. They couldn't get pure radio reception. By the way, the names of the 2 radio scientists were Wilson and Penzias, P-E-N-Z-I-A-S. Penzias is Jewish. They won the Nobel Prize for their work, and he is a Shomer Mitzvahs. I don't know if he was a Shomer Mitzvahs before, but he's a Shomer Mitzvahs. Arnold Penzias. So they published a paper. We've been working on this thing and built it this way and this way and this way, and we get this hum, and the hum is the same volume. It's the same amount of energy. Well, some people at Princeton, including James Peebles, were working on the idea of the expanding universe, and it turns out that the picture that the scientific world kept at arm's length, that it used to be smaller, no, it's infinitely big. It never was smaller. But if you took that picture seriously, when you compress things, they get hotter, warmer. Take your ice cream scoop and scoop the ice cream out. You'll see some melts right away. Because of the pressure that you put on the ice cream, it melts the ice cream. When you push things together, they get hot. So if the universe really was smaller in the past, it was very, very hot. Imagine the whole universe the size of your fist, or a peanut, or a grain of sand. That's what they talk about. So it was very hot. Okay, now it expanded out. It cooled off. Cooler and cooler and cooler, but not down to 0. There's some background heat still left over for when it was compressed together. It turns out when you calculate how much the background heat should be and how much radio interference they got at their receiver, they match. They had discovered the heat left over from when the universe was tiny. That's direct evidence, direct observation. To the credit of the scientific community, and they don't always deserve this credit, they bought it. They said, okay, we see now that it must be that the universe once was very small, and it isn't infinitely big, and it isn't going on forever. It does have a beginning. That's called the Big Bang. By the way, the term Big Bang was invented by somebody who hated it, thought it was completely ridiculous, and he coined that term as a term of abuse. What are you telling me, there was a Big Bang? And it caught on, because it's a catchy phrase. And that, of course, is the Big Bang that we all know and love. Now, what's the picture here? The whole of the scientific world for thousands of years had a fixed vision. The fixed vision is that the universe as a whole has no beginning and doesn't change in the large. In the large, it's always the same. Even Einstein, when his own equations implied that the universe could be changing, he couldn't take it. He couldn't take it. And he added a factor to them, which prevented the universe from changing. Later, he said it was the worst mistake he ever made. He could have predicted that the universe was expanding, but he couldn't face it. The whole of the scientific community couldn't face it. And in the 30s, when they cooked up the steady state theory, so that nothing's really changing and everything goes back forever, they couldn't face it. In 1965, they ran out of excuses. Now, it's really remarkable that there is a document which talks about the beginning of the universe. Gracious. And we've been talking about it for thousands of years. What is the attitude of the educated scientific and philosophical public towards our book? You're old, you're superstitious, you're ignoramuses, you come from a pre-scientific era when you didn't know things, but we today know things. And then, to their gigantic embarrassment, our pre-scientific primitive book turns out to be right, and their picture turns out to be wrong. I think that's a story worth telling to people. That the book that you are prepared to put on the shelf with all the anthropology about the primitive ancient peoples got something gigantically right about the world against the whole of the best of scientific and philosophical thinking. Show me that about the ancient Greeks. Show me that about the Zulus. Show me that about the Eskimos, where they also got something right about cosmology by accident. Now, if you happen to come across a very well-educated, very well-conversant student, he may say, but aren't there scientists who have pictures, even today, of a universe that has no beginning? The answer is, yes, there are. There are. Scientific imagination is very fertile, and they cook up these possible scenarios. They're possible, but there's no evidence for them whatsoever. They're just possible. Well, possibility is free. If you have a good imagination, then you're invited to imagine whatever you like. But the evidence that we have and the amount of precise predictions that have been fulfilled are enormous. And that being the case, at least as it looks today, we were sitting on top of a gigantic truth for thousands of years, and it took the world thousands of years to catch up. That's a story worth telling. And you can look it up in any resource under steady state, and you'll see the whole story told there. That's the second point. Third point is evolution. Now, I can say this to you, I can't say it to them, but evolution is a sugya. Every concept is in question, and there are different achronim to what is fitness and what isn't fitness, and what is do species evolve or don't they evolve. It's a tremendous, tremendously detailed, sophisticated, subtle, confusing, complicated, full of machlokes. I'm not going to take you through that, obviously. I want to give you one simple idea, one simple master idea. The way evolution is supposed to work, roughly, is you have DNA. You've heard of DNA. DNA programs how you develop. DNA changes. Changes because of, it's a big, complicated molecule. If a cosmic ray hits it, it could change it. If it's affected by chemicals, it could change. Heat stress could change it. There are various things that could change it. The changes, according to evolution, are random, unguided, unmanaged, no intelligence involved, no preference for one change over another change. They happen accidentally. You are very complicated. So is an earthworm very complicated. So is a bacterium very complicated. You have a program that's running this thing. You change something, you change it arbitrarily. Usually that's going to make it worse. You know, imagine taking your computer program and inserting in it a line from the telephone book. Is that going to improve the functioning of the computer? Probably not. So most of the time when these changes take place, they hurt the thing. It makes it function worse. Once in a trillion times by accident, the Accidental change makes it better. It makes more copies of itself, it has more descendants, more offspring, and it improves on the competition to make more offspring. That's the whole story. You're now on board. Things change randomly. Some of the changes make things better at making copies of themselves, so they make more copies of themselves. That's how life progressed from the first thing that could make copies of itself to butterflies and sequoia trees and orangutans and humans. That's the story. Now, I have one simple idea that I want to share with you. I have shared it with students for at least 20 years. I have challenged them. Write to your professors of biology. Write to your professors of philosophy, people who teach you scientific method. Ask them this question and get me an answer. If something happens and I tell you it happened by accident, there's something you need to know in order to make up your mind whether to believe me or not. Here's my example. I have an object. On one side of the object I painted an X. I threw the object into the air 3 times, and I tell you 3 times in a row it landed on the X by accident. 3 times in a row. It's not weighted, it's got a weight on one side, it's not magnetized, hasn't got ridges that catch the airflow. I threw it into the air, and randomly, accidentally, with no control, it landed on the X 3 times in a row. Do you believe me? Usually, if I present this to a class, half the heads go up and down, half the heads go back to back. And I tell them, you're all mistaken, all of you. The reason it's incorrect to say yes and incorrect to say no is because I've left out one crucial piece of information. And if you don't have that piece of information, you shouldn't say yes and you shouldn't say no. What piece of information did I leave out? How many sides the object has. I didn't say it was a coin. Most people assume it was a coin. If it's a coin, getting 3 in a row is 1 in 8. That's 12.5% of the time. It happens 12.5% of the time. If I told you it happened, you could believe me. Suppose it's got 1,000 sides. Then the probability of getting the same X 3 times in a row by accident is 1 in a billion. That's an American billion with 9 zeros, not a British billion with 12 zeros. Okay, so if it's a coin, you could easily believe me. If it's got 1,000 sides, you certainly should reject it. If I don't tell you how many sides it has, what should your response be? Your response should be, you haven't given me enough information to make up my mind. So I think you should say to a believer in evolution, you're telling me that life developed in this way by an uncontrolled, undirected, unfocused, unmanaged process, essentially by accident. According to your picture of this process, what is the probability of life arising through this process? What's the probability? 2/5? 54%? 16%? What is the probability? Give me an estimate. They can't do that. Francis Crick wrote this. You've heard of Francis Crick? One of the 2 people who deciphered DNA? He wrote this in a book called Life Itself in 1985. Oh, I know that's ancient history. I'll bring it up to date. He said the probability of life arising through what we call evolution could be 0, could be 1, or any fraction in between. We have no clue what the probability is. Recently, 2 books came out. One by Thomas Nagel called Mind and Cosmos, and one by Alvin Plantinga called Where the Conflict Really Lies, both published by Oxford, and they made the same challenge. What is your estimate of probability? Give me evidence that the probability of it happening your way isn't vanishingly small. That's the way Nagel put it. No biologist has even tried to answer. No biologist has even tried to answer. So I think the challenge to the evolution of biology should be, if you can't give me an estimate of the probability, why should I accept your picture as true? Maybe it's true. It's possible. So are leprechauns. Possible. Possibility carries very little weight. I'm prepared to admit that anything that's not self-contradictory is possible, but no one lives their lives on possibility. You live your life on probability. I want evidence. Aren't you a scientist? Don't you call yourself a scientist with a capital S? Well, where's your evidence? No evidence? And you believe it anyway? So what happened to scientific caution and skepticism and the demand for evidence? All of a sudden, so it just goes by the boards. Now, there are 2 defenses that some people, you can tell this to people and challenge them. Write to your biology professor, write to your philosophy professor and tell them. And answer me this question. How is it that you can commit yourself to something being true with no estimate of the probability of its being true? Now, sometimes you hear people say, but you're asking for something impossible. Look, the picture is you start with primitive, could be DNA or something else that makes copies of itself, the RNA world, and so forth and so on, that makes copies of itself, and undergoes changes. You know how many changes must have taken place from a single molecule to a butterfly? Millions and millions. What do you want me to do? Figure out for each change when it happened billions of years ago, and the atmosphere was different, and the oceans were different, and cosmic rays were different, and the temperatures were different. You want to figure out for each of those millions or billions of changes what the probability was that it would change that way? That's an impossible task. Okay, let's say it's impossible. What lesson should we draw from the fact that it's impossible? Should we say, since it's impossible, it's unfair to ask you to do it, and we'll believe what you say without it? No, that's the wrong lesson. The right lesson is, if it's impossible, then it's impossible for you to give me good reason to believe it. And therefore, there isn't any good reason to believe it. And therefore, I don't have to believe it. Since that, after all, is what you need to pledge allegiance to an explanation that's an accidental, unguided, unfocused explanation. And some people, as a last desperate attempt, say, but look, it's the only theory in town. Isn't it appropriate, isn't it the way science works and the way people work logically, that you accept the theory that you have until you find a better theory? You only reject the theory when you have a better substitute. In the meantime, you keep the best theory that you have. And the answer to that is no, it's incorrect. That's incorrect. The theory that you have, the best theory that you have, has to be up to a certain grade of goodness. If it doesn't get up to the grade of goodness, the course of reason is to say, I just don't know. I'll give you an analogy. A murder is committed. We're doing an investigation. We have one person with a motive. That's all. He has a motive. He stands to gain from this death. Can you put him in jail? No. If your only evidence is a motive, you cannot put him in jail. But he's your best theory? He's your best candidate? Yeah, but the bestness is 4% over 0%. 4% isn't good enough to put a person in jail. There has to be some reasonable support before you take the theory seriously. If there's no reasonable support, then what you have to say is that we just don't know. We have an open mind and we'll look for more alternatives, do more investigations. That's where the theory of evolution stands. Now, we're talking about the theory of evolution. I told you it's like a sugya, and there are different concepts. Ernst Mayr, who was a professor at Harvard, one of the great thinkers of evolution, and he did a lot of good work. He made mistakes also, but he did a lot of good work. He wrote an essay in which he pointed out the word evolution has 5 different meanings. That make you feel good? Make you feel confidence? The word evolution has 5 different meanings. And sometimes when you talk to people, when you discuss and debate how solid evolution is, you're not on the same page because you're not using the same meaning. There was a 19th century German biologist who wrote, and this has been echoed over and over again, that evolution is as certain as that the earth goes around the sun. When I first read that, I said, what? Look at all the gigantic controversies there are on the subject. Even with people who believe in it, it should be this way, it should be that way, that doesn't work, that works less. How can you say it's as certain as the earth goes around the sun? I read Mayer's essay, and he said, in those days, one of the meanings of evolution is life has changed. It hasn't always been exactly the same. That's all. There have been changes. Okay, I'm willing to admit to that. Things get bigger, things get smaller. But if that's the meaning of evolution, it's trivial. Just things change. I won't bore you with the other 4 meanings, but the meaning that I've been stressing is the mechanism that causes the changes. Sometimes they'll tell you, but you have the fossil record. You can see that birds came in at a certain point, and flowering trees came in at another point, and worms came in at another point. That's just the order of development. We could argue with that, but give them that. Okay, that's the order of development. That wasn't the issue. The issue was not what came first and what came afterwards. The issue was what made it happen that way. What's the cause of its happening that way? What's the explanation of its happening that way? That's the issue that we're fighting. We want to know whether there's a mechanism that makes it happen by itself, or whether it needs help from somewhere, and the idea of a mechanism that operates on its own simply won't do the job. For that, I need probability, and that they have no estimate of probability. Why can't we just buy the whole thing? Accept it. Why can't we say that evolution describes how HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world? This is the process that he used. The first problem is the process needs billions of years. 5,774 is not going to do it. But then maybe you could press Rabbi Schwab's idea into practice. Yes, it happened, but it happened faster. It all depends upon what you mean. Isn't that the right thing for a philosopher to say? It all depends on what you mean. If you mean that the way the theory describes it is the way the facts occurred, that's what happened. The theory says it was random. The theory says that it was self-contained, physical, and random. The theorem says there was no guiding, intelligent design. Well, that's just kfira. That's plain kfira. If you have the billions of years, you don't have the billions of years. If it happened by itself, it's kfira. If you say that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu set it up, and he set it up according to laws, which Kim'at no Rishonim believe. Set it up according to laws, and let the laws run on their own, Ozav Hashem es ha'aretz, which is the title for one of the biggest apikorsisha ideas that the Rishonim talk about. Ozav Hashem es ha'aretz. But that means that he planned it to happen. When this mutation takes place, it's because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu planned that it should take place. He programmed it in. He foresees all the results. Unless you're going to take away your dia also, become a deist. So then it's all planned. So the idea that it happened by itself, running on automatic pilot, is something which is straight kfira. We certainly can't handle that. So suppose somebody says, no, of course, Baruch Hu was guiding it, everything else is just hiding behind this appearance. He created this veneer, just like he created a veneer that the universe runs on its own, and he's really propping it up. So he created this veneer as if it was running on a strictly mechanical process of evolution. Of course, but of course it's all his activity. That picture is possible. It's possible. I don't know any Jewish sources, taking Rabbi Schwab into account, Jewish sources that would strictly contradict it. And therefore some people they want to embrace at least the appearance. It makes them look more scientific. It makes them able to hold up their heads among their non-Jewish and Jewish atheist fellows as I'm an equal, because I can talk about mutation rates and rate of spread of genes and so on and so on. But I think it's still a loss. There's a lot of critique of the details of evolution, and I've done a lot of it, and it's all recorded, because we then lose life as evidence for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's activity, as the ignoramus and fool Richard Dawkins said, and I don't use those words lightly. As he said, evolution makes it possible to be a satisfied atheist. Because I don't need God to explain where it all came from. You could say maybe it's still true, you could say that, but I don't need it. I can be an intellectually satisfied atheist. But the theory is full of holes. It's full of holes in detail, many, many holes. They're not for a tinus, it's not for 3 minutes I have left. But I'm just telling you, it's full of holes, and some of it is on my website, and some of it is on many other websites, and the pretense that the theory could even explain the details of what we see developing is a pretense without foundation. So the challenge from evolution, from our point of view, is not a serious challenge. It's a serious social challenge, serious psychological challenge. Science carries immense credibility, as you know, falsely. 2 years ago, they discovered an Earth-like planet, a star with 4 planets, 2 of which are Earth-like, and 1 of which is perfect for the development of life. One scientist said, my guess of the probability of life on that planet is 100%. We definitely have found another planet with life. Guess what happened last week? It turns out that the planet doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Because they misinterpreted certain irregularities in the motion of the star, and they attributed it to the gravitational influence of the planet, and it turns out that they misinterpreted it and interpreted it correctly. The planet doesn't exist at all. So don't be cowed when a student comes in and says, look what they discovered. I said, let's see where they undiscover it next week. This is just astonishing. For 2 years, they've been betting on this horse to the extent that a scientist could say it was a 100% probability. And it turns out it doesn't exist at all. So don't run scared, and maintain your composure, and give the answers that you can grasp them. The answers that I gave you, give those. Give them an attentive spirit, and say, this is what I've heard about this subject, and it's worthy of consideration. And if you get out of your depth, then confer with people who have more expertise in this area. I can tell you, don't run scared. There's nothing to be afraid of.